The story we're about to tell you is fictional, but it captures something profound about power, dignity, and the moment when silence finally breaks. Imagine a leader from one of the world's most overlooked nations walking into the most powerful building on earth, not to bow, not to beg, but to speak truths that have been whispered in shadows for generations. What happened next sent shock waves around the globe, changed the course of international relations, and reminded the world that some voices once freed can never be silenced again. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré Day at the White House, a day that redefined what courage looks like on the world stage. The morning of October 15 started like any other Tuesday in Washington, D.C. The autumn leaves painted the city in shades of amber and gold. Tourists clustered around the White House fence taking selfies, and inside the West Wing staffers hurried through hallways clutching coffee cups and classified briefings. Nobody, not the Secret Service agents, not the press corps, not even the president's closest advisors could have predicted that by sunset the entire foundation of American foreign policy toward Africa would be shaken to its core. The White House press room had witnessed history before. Presidents had declared wars from that podium, announced peace treaties, revealed scandals that toppled governments. The room had seen tears of grief and tears of joy, moments of triumph and moments of devastating defeat. But what was about to unfold would be different. This wouldn't be another carefully choreographed political theater. This would be raw, unfiltered truth delivered with such surgical precision that it would leave even the most seasoned Washington veterans struggling to find their footing. At 2:47 p.m. The heavy oak doors at the back of the press room opened with their familiar creak. The usual chatter among reporters died down as they expected to see the familiar face of the White House press secretary, or perhaps one of the standard parade of cabinet officials who regularly briefed the press on policy matters. Instead, what they saw made several journalists do double takes, frantically shuffling through their notes to confirm what their eyes were telling them. A man walked in alone, no entourage of security details, no team of advisors whispering last-minute talking points in his ear, no American officials flanking him to provide diplomatic cover, just one man moving with a quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to say. Ibrahim Traoré was not what Washington expected from an African leader. He wasn't wearing the expensive Western suits that most visiting dignitaries donned when they came to pay homage to American power. He wasn't carrying himself with the slightly differential posture that had become so familiar when leaders from the global south entered these sacred halls of Western authority. Instead, he wore a simple olive green military uniform, pressed and clean but unmistakably modest. His movements were measured, deliberate, like a man who had thought long and hard about every step that had brought him to this moment. The press corps, a group that prided itself on never being surprised, found themselves genuinely caught off guard. Canasso wasn't supposed to command this kind of attention. It was a landlocked West African nation that most Americans couldn't locate on a map, a place that made international headlines only when there was a coup, a terrorist attack, or another humanitarian crisis requiring Western intervention. It was the kind of country that received aid packages and development assistance, not the kind that commanded prime time in the world's most powerful building. But here was Ibrahim Traoré walking toward the podium as if he belonged there, as if he had every right to address the world's media from the heart of American power. The cameras automatically focused on him, the live feeds that normally broadcast to a modest audience suddenly carrying an electric tension that even the most experienced broadcast journalists could feel through their screens. He reached the podium and placed both hands on its sides, not gripping it nervously like so many speakers did, but settling into position like a man preparing to deliver a message he had been carrying for years. The room fell completely silent. Even the whispered conversations between reporters and their editors through earpieces seemed to pause. The only sound was the soft mechanical whir of camera lenses adjusting their focus. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the diplomatic pleasantries that usually began such addresses. No thank you for having me, no it's an honor to be here, no acknowledgement of the tremendous privilege it was for a leader from his position to address the American press corps. I am not here to beg. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Reporters who had been casually checking their phones suddenly snapped to attention. In the control rooms where television producers monitored multiple feeds, conversation stopped mid-sentence. This wasn't how these events typically began. I am here to remind you Africa does not kneel anymore. A visible ripple went through the room. Seasoned correspondents who had covered everything from presidential scandals to international crises found themselves scrambling to process what they were hearing. This wasn't the usual diplomatic speak filled with careful euphemisms and non-committal language. This was something else entirely, direct, uncompromising, and delivered with a calm certainty that was somehow more unsettling than if it had been shouted. The silence that followed was unlike anything the White House press room had experienced. It wasn't the polite quiet of an audience waiting for more information. It was the stunned silence of people who had just witnessed something they weren't sure they were prepared for. Several reporters glanced at each other, their expressions mixing confusion with a growing realization that they were witnessing something historically significant. Troy continued, his voice maintaining the same measured cadence but each word carrying the weight of centuries of suppressed frustration. For decades we have been called unstable, corrupt, unready for freedom. We've been the testing ground for your weapons, the burial ground for your failures, and the poster child for your charity. A correspondent from the New York Times visibly shifted in her seat in the back row. A reporter from the Washington Post was frantically typing notes on his laptop, his fingers struggling to keep pace with the unfolding moment. The CNN cameras, which have been set for a routine diplomatic address, suddenly felt the weight of broadcasting, something that was clearly going to redefine how America and Africa spoke to each other. But Troy wasn't finished. If anything, he was just getting started. But today I stand here to say we have found our own voice, not because you gave it to us but because we remembered it was always ours. The implications of those words began to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just a diplomatic statement, this was a declaration of independence from the entire framework that had governed Western African relations for generations. The reporters trained to maintain professional neutrality found themselves grappling with something that transcended normal political discourse. He looked directly into the CNN camera, his gaze steady and unwavering. For millions of viewers around the world who were watching the live feed, it felt as if he was speaking directly to them, cutting through the layers of media interpretation and diplomatic translation to deliver his message without filter. We are not a project, we are not an experiment in Western patience, we are a civilization older than the names you call us, by stronger than the walls you build to keep us out. In television control rooms across the globe, producers were making rapid decisions. What had begun as routine coverage of a minor diplomatic event was clearly becoming something much more significant. The BBC interrupted its regular programming. France 24 extended its coverage. Al Jazeera began broadcasting the speech with live translation into Arabic, reaching audiences across the Middle East and North Africa who rarely saw African leaders speaking with such directness on the global stage. Troy paused, and in that pause hearts raced. The silence stretched just long enough for the full weight of his words to settle, for viewers to lean forward in their seats, for the collective breath of the room to be held in anticipation of what would come next. When you speak of democracy, ask yourselves, did you let our people vote freely, or did you choose for us? When you speak of freedom, ask yourselves, did you leave our minerals untouched, or did you finance the men who enslaved our children to mine them? The questions hung in the air like accusations that couldn't be dismissed or deflected. These weren't rhetorical flourishes, they were pointed challenges to the very foundations of Western foreign policy. In Africa, a reporter from Reuters actually dropped her pen, the small clattering sound somehow amplified in the unprecedented quiet of the room. In the upper levels of the White House, where senior staff monitored all press room activities, urgent conversations were beginning. This wasn't going according to any script. The carefully managed relationship between Western powers and African nations was being dissected in real time. Broadcast lived to a global audience that was growing by the minute as word spread across social media platforms. We are not your silence, we are not your darkness, we are the storm you tried to contain for centuries, and we are rising. The metaphor was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just one man speaking, this was the voice of an entire continent finding its expression through his words. The implications were staggering, and everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be studied, analyzed, and remembered for generations. Then Troy did something that nobody expected. He paused again, longer this time, and when he continued, his voice carried a different quality, more personal, more reflective, as if he was sharing a private realization with the world. We used to believe we needed permission to speak in these halls, not anymore. Those words hit differently than everything that had come before. They weren't just about policy or international relations, they were about dignity, about the fundamental human right to speak truth to power without asking for permission first. In that moment, every person in the room understood that they weren't just witnessing a diplomatic address, they were seeing the birth of a new era in how Africa would engage with the world. From somewhere in the back of the room came a sound that nobody could quite identify at first, a voice cracking, a low gasp of recognition. A White House staffer, a young African-American woman who had spent years working in the careful, measured world of Washington diplomacy, stood up slowly. Her movement was involuntary, driven by something deeper than professional protocol. She was visibly shaken, tears forming in her eyes as she recognized something profound happening in front of her. Troy's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of the reporters, the cameras, the sudden electric tension that had transformed what should have been a routine press briefing into something approaching a historical inflection point. If this offends you, ask why. This frightens you, ask what you've built your comfort on. The challenge was direct, uncompromising, and impossible to ignore. These weren't the words of a leader seeking approval or assistance. These were the words of someone who had found his voice and intended to use it regardless of the consequences. The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. The initial shock was giving way to something else, a recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the last few minutes. The old rules, the old ways of conducting international relations between the West and Africa had just been called into question in the most public way possible. Then something extraordinary happened. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sound of a chair being pushed back, then another, one by one. Journalists began to stand, not because they were applauding, there was no applause, not because they necessarily agreed with everything they had heard. Professional neutrality still held sway, but because something ancient and honest had just been spoken in a place where such honesty was rarely heard. The standing was involuntary, driven by a recognition that transcended political agreement or disagreement. It was the acknowledgement that they had just witnessed someone speak their complete truth in one of the most powerful rooms in the world, without compromise, without fear, and without asking for permission. As the reporters stood, the cameras captured the moment from multiple angles. The image would become iconic, a room full of hardened journalists rising not in celebration but in recognition of something profound they had just witnessed. The visual was powerful, but it was the silence that made it unforgettable. No cheers, no protests, just the quiet acknowledgement that the rules of the game had just been rewritten. Troy stood at the podium for a moment longer, his message delivered, his purpose fulfilled. Then, with the same quiet dignity with which he had entered, he stepped back from the podium and walked toward the exit. No questions from the press. He had said what he came to say, no final remarks or diplomatic pleasantries, just the echo of truth left hanging in the air. Within minutes of Troy leaving the podium, the internet exploded with a force that surprised even the most experienced social media analysts. #Traore at the White House didn't just trend, it became a global phenomenon, reaching the top of trending lists in over 50 countries. Within the first hour, the clips began spreading immediately. TikTok users created dozens of different edits, each highlighting different moments from the speech. Some focused on his opening declaration, others on his direct challenges to Western policy. The most popular clips were those that captured the moment when reporters began standing, the visual representation of truth, forcing recognition even from those whose job it was to remain neutral. On Twitter, now rebranded as X, the response was immediate and intense. African users shared the clips with comments like, "This is what we've been waiting to hear for decades." American users were more divided, some calling it the most honest assessment of U.S.-Africa relations they had ever heard, others dismissing it as anti-Western propaganda. But it was the international response that truly captured the magnitude of what had just happened. The BBC broke protocol by immediately scheduling a rebroadcast of the full speech during their primetime news hour. France 24 assembled an emergency panel to discuss the implications. A laser interrupted regular programming to provide live commentary and analysis. CNN made the unprecedented decision to air the complete speech again during their evening primetime slot, something they had never done for a diplomatic address from an African leader. The decision sparked internal debates within the network, but the viewer response made it clear that this was exactly what audiences wanted to see. MSNBC's evening panel show became must-watch television when their standard discussion devolved into something approaching chaos. It started when one of their regular political commentators dismissed Troy's speech as calculated anti-Western propaganda designed to deflect from real governance issues. In Burkina Faso, the comment might have passed without much notice on any other night, but this wasn't any other night. Dr. Amara Okafor, a former Ghanaian ambassador to the United States who is serving as a guest panelist, immediately challenged the characterization with respect. She said, her voice carrying decades of diplomatic experience, what you just heard wasn't propaganda, it was the voice of a continent that has finally decided to speak its truth without filtering it through Western sensibilities. First, the exchange that followed was electric. The regular commentator, clearly uncomfortable with being challenged so directly, doubled down on his position. But surely you can't support this kind of inflammatory rhetoric in a diplomatic setting. There are established ways to conduct international relations. Dr. Okafor's response became one of the most shared clips from the entire day. Those established ways, you're referring to who established them, and why are we required to follow rules that were written without our input, in our absence, often explicitly to exclude our voices? Can you believe what we just witnessed? This wasn't just a speech, this was a complete dismantling of diplomatic norms that have existed for decades. But here's what's even more incredible, the reactions pouring in from around the world are showing us that millions of people have been waiting their entire lives to hear someone speak like this on such a stage. The panel continued for nearly an hour, far longer than Originally scheduled as producers recognized they were capturing something significant. The debate touched on everything from colonial history to contemporary economic relationships, but it all came back to the central question Troy had posed: who gets to speak, how they're allowed to speak, and what happens when someone refuses to follow the script. Meanwhile, in newsrooms around the world, editors were grappling with how to frame the story, the traditional diplomatic language that usually accompanied such events felt inadequate. How do you describe a moment when someone deliberately breaks every rule of diplomatic discourse and somehow makes it feel more honest than anything that had come before? The Guardian's headline read, "Burkina Faso leader delivers unfiltered truth to Washington." The New York Times went with African leader White House address challenges decades of diplomatic protocol. Le Monde, perhaps feeling the particular sting of Troy's references to French influence in Africa, published a more measured analysis. Burkina Faso's Troy addresses colonial legacy in unprecedented White House speech, but it was the reactions from ordinary people that truly captured the impact of what had happened in coffee shops, on university campuses, in community centers across America and around the world. People were pulling up the clips on their phones, sharing them with friends, debating the implications. At Howard University, the historically black university in Washington, D.C., students gathered spontaneously in the main quad as word spread about the speech. Someone had connected their laptop to portable speakers and small crowds formed around each viewing station. The reactions were immediate and emotional: cheers at certain moments, stunned silence at others, tears from students who had never heard their experience articulated so clearly on such a prominent stage. Marcus Johnson, a senior political science major whose family had immigrated from Nigeria, later told reporters, "I've been in America for most of my life and I've never heard someone speak for me in that building. I've watched dozens of African leaders go to the White House and they always seemed like they were asking permission to exist. This was different. This was someone demanding to be heard." The impact wasn't limited to African and African American communities at universities across the country. Professors were hastily revising their international relations curricula to include discussion of what was already being called the Troy moment. Students in political science, international affairs, and African studies programs found themselves in impromptu discussions about the speech, with many noting that it had fundamentally changed how they thought about power dynamics in international relations. The response from official Washington WA